Hello everybody, Namaste. Welcome to EPG Pathshala of Japanese. I am Anita Khanna from JNU and today we are going to study an outline of Japanese literature. The title of this paper 15 is Introduction to Japanese Literature in English, and having come midway, let's study about the characteristics of the periods we have studied so far. As you all know that civilizations have something in common, and the most common factor which is very obvious is the some kind of oral transformation of the information, or you can say oral transmission through the word of mouth by way of prayers or hymns, legends, mythology, folklore, and these are orally transmitted elements that are codified at some later point of time. So, because there is no written records, could be due to the absence of native script or development of script, or likewise such information is handed down orally from one generation to the other, and in the process so many new elements are added to it, so it loses its historical authenticity. However, another noticeable point is that these imaginative or oral traditions are usually found in the verse form, which are handed down and then scribed at some point of time. This could be attributed to the process of its oral transmission. The most creative works of the ancient period are in epic forms of poetry rather than in prose. However, Japan differs as far as such creation myths are concerned, and we find that the creation myths in Japanese are in prose form rather than verse. Of course, the tradition of combining prose and verse is, or prose and poetry is commonly found in all the historical periods of Japan. However, the seeds of such creations are found in the oral tradition and in lyrical forms. It is in the form of Shinto prayers. As we have studied that Shinto is the native religion of Japan before Buddhism reached there, and these were sung in the native Yamato language, which did not have a script at that point of a time, and Yamato means Japan. It is the old name of Japan, and Yamato language refers to the language spoken by the people in Yamato region. So, the Shinto prayers, the way of gods, is the meaning of Shinto. Like this Shinto, which is of two characters, one is kami or the gods, and the other character is michi, the way of gods. As we know, michi means the way. So, this ancient religion of Japan was based on the practices of nature worship, like we find in most of the agricultural societies. In Japan too, people were in awe of natural forces, and their main occupation in the ancient times was to appease these natural forces so that it is in harmony and there are no calamities. So their mind was preoccupied with some way to please the gods, like the god of rain or the god of thunder and so on. So these natural forces formed the object of their reverence, and the ceremonial prayers were recited to pacify the elements which were adverse and please those who supported their agriculture positively. It was to pray for constant support and the ideal climatic conditions, good harvest and ample rainfall. The rain god, the sun goddess. Incidentally, in Japan, sun is not god but a goddess. Likewise, wind, fire, sea god and such other gods symbolize the various natural forces. It is said that Japan is 10,000 gods and deities and they live in harmony with the people. Yao yorozu no kamigami no kuni to iwaretemasu. These lyrical and ceremonial prayers called Norito and Shukuji were conceived and arranged on the basis of the Japanese people's belief in Kotodama, the spirit of words, implying that the sacred meaning hidden in each word should be effectively used. And like any other country, they had a firm belief that if these prayers are invoked correctly, they would bring about the desirable effects. Like this, the composition was carefully arranged and a proper arrangement of words were conceived to bring about the desirable effects. In other words, prosperity for the people and to ward off any misfortune or evil. Now these prayers later on influence the literary creations or literary formations, especially the poetry in the years to come. The point that I want to make is that it is quite obvious that the primitive Norito prayers were not composed at random, but they were skillfully and carefully composed with a fine blend of words that were arranged in order to bring about positive energy. And these were offered to the gods with the purity of mind to get divine protection. So are the myths and legends that constitute the mainstay of the oral transmission in any country. They were also skillfully stringed together with due consideration paid to the words and events. These legends relate the story of creation of Japanese archipelago and its people and rulers and the various natural forces and objects of nature like trees, mountains, hot springs, besides sun, moon, earth, storm, etc. So with such diversified body of subject matter from the oral tradition, which provided the fertile grounds for the literary creation and offered the literary themes when the need for the written word was realized and contributed to the development of Japanese literature. We can broadly arrange it in the periods I explain hereafter in a very concise form. The first period in which we have the written accounts or written records, which was a shift from oral to the written forms, is Nara period. This period refers to the time when Yamato clan unified the Japanese people and the capital was set up in the city of Nara in 710. This was the period when Buddhism was introduced in Japan. Taika reforms modeled after the Chinese administration were set up and Taiho Code again based on the Chinese models was promulgated and active exchange of people and information with the mainland through the mission of Kenzuishi and Kentoshi was officially exchanged. The literary words of this period are mostly a kind of official literature compiled and written on the orders of the central authority. Although there were some exceptions, we have the Hitomaro Kasho, an individual anthology of the poet Kakimoto no Hitomaro, which was later merged into the gigantic collection of poetry called Manyoshu. The first work of written form is the Jushichijo Kempo, which was written by Prince Shotoku in early 7th century. So, this constitution of 17 articles had the elements of compassion, harmony and other merits that were considered necessary for the people to make necessary for the people for the development of Yamato state. The first work of Japanese literature is Kojiki, and this work, the main thrust was on the historical records, and they were not created at the will of any single individual but compiled as historical records on the orders of central, on the initiative of central authority. This was the objective was, it was conceived in order to maintain the records of the imperial family as an evidence of their legitimate authority in the domestic front and were written in Hentai Kambun, in other words the Kambun Chinese, which was written for meaning as well as for pronunciation. As we know, the prose till that time, especially for the official work, was Kambun, the Chinese script which Japanese borrowed, and it was in Nara period. When Kojiki is written, it is in the transform Hentai Kambun of the actual. It means that the kanji characters which stand for meaning are also used for pronunciation and not meaning. In Nara period, the historical records in pure Chinese or Kambun, which was used by Japanese for official purpose, were also recorded, and these come to us in the form of Rikkokushi, the 6 compilations of the national histories, which was modeled after Chinese examples, and these are important compilations to understand the history of Japan and were compiled on the initiative of Emperor Temmu, who was visionary, and the foremost work which was ordered by him along with Kojiki is Nihon Shoki. The Nara period lasted after the capital was shifted from Nara to Kyoto. So, the next period comes to us in the form of Heian period, and With the shift of capital to Kyoto, it marks the beginning of Heian period or the period of peace. It set in a long era of peaceful developments for about 400 years. As the aristocracy and its power declined and their systems began to collapse, it was the army generals who seized power and brought about the end of the Heian period. Let's have a look at the salient features of Heian period. This was a long period of political stability with the Fujiwara family at the helm of power. There was an avid literary activity that preoccupied the court people and aristocracy. There was constant developments both in prose as well as poetry. Due to the adverse conditions in China, the influence from China declined and it gave a chance for the Japanese native tradition to develop by leaps and bounds. Kana syllabary or the native kana writing was developed and it gave a means for the women writers to emerge who were not bound by any models and they could express themselves freely. Although these women writers, known as Nyobo, were not recognized as front-line writers or appreciated or given any position besides being court ladies, they left a legacy of literary works behind and their contribution further enriched the literature of the ancient period and provided the model for the later periods. The world famous novel of Genji Monogatari, The Tale of Prince Genji by Lady Murasaki Shikibu, who was a Nyobo, was written during Heian period. Also, the new style of fiction called Monogatari surfaced and developed in the form of Joryu Bungaku, which contained women's diaries like Nikki Bungaku, Zuihitsu, the works of miscellany in prose as well as waka poetry, the native Japanese short verse. So it was the court literature infused with sentiments of love, beauty, appreciation of nature and full of court romances, fiction, fantasy, filled with the fine sensitivity and especially the fictional works of Monogatari as well as the waka poetry lasted in different forms until the modern era began. As I mentioned that the aristocracy or the Heian period declined because of the rise of army generals and this resulted in the next era of Kamakura period. The Kamakura period marks the beginning of Middle Ages or Chusei. The rise of these warriors was the outcome of the long period of Heian, which was peaceful, full of aesthetic romances. But in the provinces, the local Mussulmen who under the system of Shoen or the tax-free lands had gathered local support and strength, and this was also facilitated by the socio-political conditions of the time. They clashed with each other to seize power and ultimately out of various clans two top rivals, Taira and Minamoto, emerged. Finally, under the authority of Minamoto no Yoritomo, the Kamakura shoguns came out to establish their headquarters in the city of Kamakura, where they ruled and came to be known as Kamakura generals or Kamakura Bakufu. And hence the name Kamakura, which was the city from where Kamakura generals ruled. It was a period of constant power struggle, and there was overall chaos, gloom, and despair. People turned, due to the constant fights, the people turned more and more to religion, and that to Buddhism for hope and solace, with the result that several new sects of Buddhism emerged who were simple and emphasized thus the recitation of the name of Buddha, which will give them salvation. In literature also, the writers lamented the evanescence of worldly things, and impermanence or mujokan became the key word of the literary works of the Middle Ages. At the same time, the bravery of the samurai who fought either from the Taira side or Minamoto side, the initial two rivals, symbolized the bravery and the culture and spirit of the warriors. And it was in complete contrast to the literature of the earlier periods of Heian, which was infused by Shikikan, and in other words appreciation of seasonal beauties, nature, and court romances. And now the Kamakura literature was realistic, and we have the chronicles written during this time which describe the warfare and chaos, and these have been handed down in the literary works of Gunki Monogatari or the war tales. Incidentally, the Monogatari is the fiction or the prose works which developed in the Heian period and were based on fantasy. Now, in Kamakura period, it was realism which marked these works. Subsequently, in 1338, the Ashikaga generals established their authority, and the next period comes to us as Muromachi period or the Ashikaga period, which lasted from 14th century up to the end of 15th century, 1392 to 1490. So, the Ashikaga general named Ashikaga no Takauji established the shogunate in place Muromachi near Kyoto. This became the center of powers of these shoguns, and so the name Muromachi or Ashikaga period. It continued to be a period of warfare and struggle, especially at this time there was a dual seat of imperial power. This unprecedented incident happened when the emperor had fled to Yoshino, a place near Kyoto Nara, had fled to a place called Yoshino, and the another emperor with authority in Kyoto continued, and like this there was a dual seat of imperial power, one at Yoshino and the other at Kyoto. These Ashikaga generals were great patrons of culture, and so arts like tea ceremony, chado, flower arrangement, kado, martial arts related to bushido, the way of samurai, could nurture and develop. The trends in literature, especially in prose, were characterized by popular folk tales in the form of fairy tales and were called otogizoshi. And in the case of poetry, waka was replaced by linked verse called renga, which became widely popular. The first, as we know, that the renga replaced the waka poetry of previous age, and we have 22 waka anthologies since the first one named Kokin Waka Shu. Now the first anthology of renga poetry was compiled, and it has come down to us as Tsukuba Shu in 1356 and continued and reached its peak in the Ashikaga period. The theatre, No and Kyogen also were patronized by the Ashikaga generals, and the plots of highly literary caliber were written and has come down in the form of Fushika Den, and in drama No and Kyogen plots were also written down, and these are of high literary value. In fact, the culture and literature of this period, or rather this age and from hereafter, began to spread among masses rather than remaining the prerogative of aristocracy or warrior or the ruling class. And this phenomena, which is Gecko Cujo, or the popularization of culture and literature and trends that were carried forward by the common people. Gecko Cujo means the lower echelons or the lower layers of society gradually come up and govern the cultural literary trends. Gecko Cujo, which became a keyword of this period and the periods to come. Thank you.